Need to check the names list and then write the story. Names to avoid: Dana, Garrett, Marcus, Neil, Renee, Patrice, Clive, Theo, Ray, Carol, Owen, Sylvie, Troy, Leonard, Joel, Diane, Brandon, Claire, Walt, Harriet, Curtis, Petra, Eli, Mara, Conrad, Sasha, Hatchet, Felix, Bridget, Hank, Kevin, Patrick, Ivy, Gordon, Warren, Lily, Pam, Sylvia, Russell, Hale, Cody, Margaret, Terry, Nadine, Aiden, Cooper, Damon, Nate, Andrea, Gerald, Vivienne, August. New names I'll use: narrator, I, wife equals my wife, best friend equals my best friend, lawyer equals my attorney, neighbor equals my neighbor. Supporting names: Lena, wife, Doug, best friend, Victor, attorney, Serena, club contact. I'll be honest with you. I'm not the kind of man who looks for trouble. I never have been. I coached Little League for 4 years. I showed up to every neighborhood block party with a cooler full of drinks I didn't even want, and I once helped an elderly stranger change a flat tire in the rain for 45 minutes without being asked. That's who I am, or at least, that's who I thought I was being rewarded for being. My wife and I met when we were both 26. I was finishing up my residency, internal medicine, and she was working in hospital administration, 2 floors above where I spent most of my waking hours. We ran into each other in the parking garage one November evening, both reaching for the same broken umbrella stand near the elevator. She laughed. I said something dumb. She laughed again anyway. That was it. We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard in Ohio. Nothing fancy. Lawn chairs, string lights, a catering company her cousin owned that ran out of chicken by 7 o'clock. I thought it was perfect. I still do. For the first 8 years, we were good. Better than good, actually. We were good at better than good, actually. We bought a house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus. She left hospital work and started a boutique event planning business out of our spare bedroom. I made partner at a small private practice. We talked about kids. Decided we'd wait a little longer, then waited a little longer than that. The way couples do when life keeps getting in the way of itself. I want to be clear about that stretch of time because it matters. We were happy. Or I was happy. And I believe she was too. Looking back, I wonder how much of what I saw was real and how much was a picture I had decided to believe in. That question still follows me around on bad nights. It started. The thing I can point to now and say, that was the first crack. About 14 months before everything fell apart. She started working late, not occasionally, consistently. 3-4 nights a week, she would text me around 6 to say a client meeting had run long, or there was a venue walkthrough she hadn't anticipated, or her assistant had made a scheduling error that needed fixing. I believed her. She'd always been organized to a fault, so logistical chaos at work didn't seem impossible. But then small things started not adding up. Her event planning calendar, which she used to keep open on the shared laptop, disappeared behind a password I didn't have. When I mentioned it casually, she said she had confidential client contracts on there now, and her business attorney had advised discretion. I accepted that. When she started taking her phone into the bathroom every single night, I told myself it was a bad habit she'd picked up scrolling before bed. When she bought a second cell phone and told me it was a dedicated work line, I thought about it for exactly 1 day and then filed it in the back of my mind under things I should probably revisit, but won't. I was busy. I was tired. I was also, I think, a little afraid of what revisiting it might mean. The moment I couldn't explain away happened on a Tuesday in February. I came home early from work, a patient cancellation freed up my afternoon, and let myself in through the side door. My wife's car was gone. She'd told me she had a bridal expo downtown. But on the kitchen counter was a small notepad she used for client notes. The top page was blank. But you know how sometimes you can see the impression of whatever was written on the page above. I held it under the light from the window almost out of idle curiosity. There was an address, and below it, 2 words that I stared at long enough that the afternoon light moved across the floor: Tuesday nights. I tore the page off the pad and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't do anything with it right away. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. The address could be a venue. Tuesday nights could mean anything. I was a physician. I knew the damage that assumptions did when they bypassed evidence. So I waited. I watched. I became very quiet and very patient in a way I don't think my wife noticed, and I am usually the first to admit I am not a patient man. 3 weeks later, I drove to the address on that note. It was on the east side of the city, a part of town that used to be industrial, repurposed warehouses, a few craft breweries, a couple of parking lots that charged $18 and didn't give receipts. The address itself was a building with no signage. Black painted windows, a door with a card reader and a small camera mounted above it. 2 men standing outside, not quite dressed like bouncers, but doing the job of bouncers. I sat in my car for a while and just looked at it. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not sleep. I need to tell you something about my best friend because he is part of this story in a way I am still not entirely finished grieving. Doug and I had been friends since our freshman year of college. Roommates, then teammates on an intramural basketball team we took far too seriously, then best men at each other's weddings. He was the first person I called when my father died. He drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to sit with me in a hospital waiting room and didn't say anything until I was ready to talk. That is the kind of man I believe Doug was. He was also the one who, about 6 months before I found that address, had suggested my wife's business was really taking off. Said he'd heard her mention a new corporate client that was keeping her hopping. Said she seemed great, actually, really thriving. He said it in a specific way, offhand, volunteering information I hadn't asked for, that I didn't think anything of at the time. I thought about that conversation a lot in February, and then in March, when I started doing things I am not proud of but do not apologize for, I hired a private investigator. I want to be plain about this because some people I've told this to reacted like I had done something underhanded. I was a married man with growing suspicions about a building my wife visited on Tuesday nights and a best friend who seemed oddly informed about her schedule. Hiring a professional to find out what was happening is not underhanded. It is the opposite of underhanded. It is the measured, rational response I wish I'd had the clarity to pursue 2 months earlier. The investigator, a former sheriff's deputy named Victor, who had exactly the kind of unremarkable face that I imagine makes him very good at his job, came back to me in 10 days. He came to my office. He closed the door. He put a folder on my desk and he said, "I want you to take a breath before you open that." I didn't take a breath. I opened it. The building had a name. Not a public name. Not something on a website or a sign. But a name that circulated in a specific, private world. My wife was not just a visitor. She had been going there for, as best Victor could determine, approximately 2 years. There were photographs taken from a legal distance on the public sidewalk. My wife entering. My wife leaving. My wife in conversation with other women in the parking lot, and in 4 of the photographs, entering or exiting within minutes of my wife, Doug. I sat with that folder for a long time after Victor left. What I felt in that moment wasn't the explosion I might have expected. It was more like watching a building implode in one of those controlled demolition videos. Everything folding inward, floor by floor, in exactly the way structural physics would predict if you knew where the charges were placed. Terrible. Inevitable. Strangely quiet. I did not call my wife. I did not call Doug. I called my attorney. Her name was Serena, a family law specialist I had been referred to by a colleague whose own divorce had, by his description, been a surgical strike. I met with her for 90 minutes the following morning. I brought the folder. I told her everything I knew and everything I suspected and the parts I wasn't sure about. She listened without reacting, which I found both professional and mildly unsettling. At the end, she folded her hands on the desk and told me we needed more before we moved. She was right. I knew she was right. What I had was photographs of my wife at a building and proximity to my best friend. That was not a divorce case. That was a suspicion with good photography. So I kept living my life. I came home, I had dinner with my wife, I asked about her day and listened to her answer, and I looked at her face across the table and tried to find the woman I had married, in the woman who was currently telling me about a spring gala she was coordinating for a pharmaceutical company. She was still there on the surface. She still laughed the same way. She still stole the blanket every night. She still left her coffee cup on the wrong side of the sink. I felt like I was disappearing, one meal at a time. Victor came back to me 6 weeks later with something that changed the shape of everything. He had connected with the source. He didn't tell me how, and I didn't ask, who had been involved with the establishment and had recently departed under acrimonious circumstances. This person was willing to talk. What they described was an operation that had been running for nearly 3 years, a private membership club, not illegal in itself, but operating well outside the bounds of what a reasonable person would call acceptable. My wife was not a member. My wife was, in the words of Victor's source, one of the 3 women who ran it. I read that sentence 4 times. She was not participating casually. She had an operational role. She managed relationships, coordinated events, handled what Victor's source called the hospitality side. She was, in a meaningful sense, part of the architecture of the thing. And then Victor told me the second part. There was a child, a boy, approximately 11 years old, who was being raised by my wife's younger sister in a town about 90 minutes from ours. My wife visited once a month, always on a Sunday when I played golf with a group from work. A group I now recognized she had been instrumental in organizing, going back years. The boy's father was unknown, or at least unacknowledged. The pregnancy had happened before we were married, but the child had been born 2 months after our wedding. My wife had never told me. I went outside and sat on the steps behind my office building in the cold for about 20 minutes. 11 years. A child she had carried, delivered, placed with her sister, and then built an entire secondary calendar around for 11 years. While I was coaching Little League, while I was helping strangers with flat tires, while I was sitting across from her asking about pharmaceutical galas and stealing back the blanket and believing, with everything I had, that I knew who she was. I called Serena from those steps. I said, I'm ready. What happened over the next 4 weeks was the most methodical period of my life. Serena filed for divorce on a Thursday morning, citing irreconcilable differences on the paperwork, deliberately vague. She advised me not to reveal what I knew until we were in a controlled setting where the documentation could be presented properly. So I went home that Thursday evening. I had dinner with my wife. I asked about her day. She told me about a venue cancellation. I said that sounded frustrating. I passed her the salt. The lock on her house was changed the following Monday while she was out, by a locksmith Serena had recommended. My wife did not know this until she tried to come home that evening and found a letter from Serena's office taped to the door. I was not home when this happened. Serena had advised me to stay elsewhere that night, and I did. I checked into a hotel 2 miles away and sat on the edge of the bed watching the Weather Channel for 3 hours because I could not focus on anything that required following a story. My wife called me 17 times between 6 and 10 p.m. I did not answer. Serena had told me not to, and for once in my life I was listening to someone smarter than me. Our court date was 6 weeks later. I had not seen my wife in person during that time. I had received, through Serena, a series of increasingly escalating communications, from disbelief to outrage to what I can only describe as a negotiation attempt that assumed I knew less than I did. Her attorney was competent, but had clearly not been told the full picture by his client. That was going to be a problem for her. The morning of the hearing, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and did the thing I always do when I am nervous, which is make a list in my head of everything I know to be true. I knew that I'd married someone I loved. I knew that she had maintained a secret life for the duration of our marriage. I knew that there was a child I had never been told about. I knew that my best friend had been part of whatever this was. I knew that I had done nothing wrong except perhaps wait too long to ask questions I was afraid to ask. That last one I'm still working on. The hearing itself was not the dramatic scene I had half expected and half dreaded. Courtrooms, in my experience now, are mostly a lot of waiting punctuated by very deliberate, very careful language. Serena was extraordinary. She presented the investigator's documentation, the corroborating testimony from Victor's source, who had agreed to provide a sworn statement, the financial records that showed my wife had been depositing income into an account I had no knowledge of for approximately 26 months, and the documentation regarding the child. My wife's attorney asked for a recess twice. My wife, for her part, looked at me across the room at one point. I think she was trying to find the version of me that would soften. that would remember the parking garage and the broken umbrella stand in the backyard in Ohio and pull back. I don't know what she saw when she looked. I kept my face neutral. I had been practicing keeping my face neutral for about 10 weeks by then, and I had gotten reasonably good at it. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain who clearly had no patience for anything that was not directly relevant. She reviewed the materials. She asked my wife's attorney several pointed questions that he answered poorly. She looked over her glasses at my wife once for a long moment without saying anything. The settlement was not in my wife's favor. The account she had hidden was considered marital income under Ohio law, and the court ordered full disclosure and equitable division, which in practice meant she was returning a significant amount of money to a joint pool. The house was awarded to me. She was granted 30 days to retrieve her belongings with a stipulated schedule and a third party present. There was a brief, ugly moment when her attorney raised the question of the child, attempting to argue, I think, that I had some obligation or standing with regard to the boy. Serena dispatched this in about 4 sentences. I had never been told about the child. I had never been presented as his father. I had never been given the opportunity to make any decision about that relationship. The court agreed that this matter was a separate family law question that would need to be addressed in a different proceeding if anyone chose to pursue it. I did not pursue it. That is a decision I made carefully, and I stand by it. Doug never contacted me during any of this, not once. I don't know if that makes it worse or better. I think I expected him to reach out at some point to explain or apologize or at minimum to acknowledge that 20 years of friendship were ending. He didn't. A mutual friend told me about 3 months later that Doug had moved to another state. I absorbed this information and then I went back to whatever I'd been doing, which I think was reading the paper on my back porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee that was too hot and the particular kind of quiet that takes a while to learn how to appreciate. I still live in the house. I kept a dog, a 7-year-old shepherd mix named Buckley, who was as bewildered by all of this as I was, and handled it by sleeping more than usual, which honestly was not a bad strategy. I work the same hours. I still go to block parties, though I bring fewer drinks now because I've started to feel more honest about what I actually want to do at a given time and what I've just gotten into the habit of doing. The thing about betrayal, the particular kind of sustained architectural betrayal I'm describing, is that it doesn't leave you the way a wound leaves you. A wound heals or it scars, and either way you can point to where it was. This is more like discovering that the house you've lived in for a decade was built on a different foundation than the one on the blueprints. The house is still standing. You're still in it. But you walk around it differently now, with a kind of peripheral awareness you can't quite shut off. I'm not telling the story because I want sympathy. I want to be very clear about that. I'm telling it because I spent a long time thinking that the kind of man who something like this happens to must have missed something obvious, must have been willfully blind, must have been partly responsible for the architecture of his own deception. I believed that for a while. A therapist I started seeing about 4 months in helped me put that down. You can be a careful person and still be lied to carefully. You can love someone genuinely and still not know them completely. These are not character defects. They are the ordinary conditions of trusting another human being, which is itself an ordinary act that most of us do every day without treating it as the risk that it actually is. My wife knew exactly who she was the whole time. I know that now. She made choices consistently across years in full knowledge of what she was doing and what it would eventually cost. That is on her. Every last stone of that particular foundation is hers. I went to Ohio last spring, first time since the divorce, drove past her mother's backyard on the way to visit an old college friend. The string lights were still up on the fence posts, faded from the look of them, but still there. I sat at the end of the street for a minute with the window down and the engine running. Then I drove on. There's a version of this story where I stay angry, where the ending is about Lena losing the house and Doug disappearing to another state and me sitting in my attorney's office with a settlement in my favor and I let that be the whole thing. Some days it almost was, but I've had enough time with it now to know that the anger was never really the point. The anger was just the loudest part, the part that showed up first and took up all the space. Underneath it was something quieter and a lot harder to look at, which was the question of what I had been choosing not to see and why. I am not saying I caused this. I want to be precise about that. because I think there's a version of personal accountability that slides too easily into self-blame, and I'm not interested in that version. Lena made choices. She made them consistently across years with full awareness of what she was doing. That belongs to her completely. But I also know that somewhere around the third or fourth month of noticing things that didn't add up, I filed them away instead of asking the question. Not because I was stupid, because I was afraid of what an honest answer would cost me. That's the thing I've had to sit with. Not her deception, that was hers, but my own willingness to accept a comfortable version of my life over a true one. That is a different kind of problem, and it doesn't go away just because you win in court. What I've come to understand is that intelligence, real intelligence, isn't just about being right. It's about being willing to ask the question even when the answer is going to cost you something. I had plenty of information. What I lacked for too long was the courage to do anything with it. The notepad, the password, the second phone. The way Doug mentioned her schedule a little too casually that one afternoon. Every one of those was a door I walked past because opening it meant the house I'd built in my head would stop being the house I actually lived in. That is a failure of nerve, not of intelligence. And recovering from it, not from the betrayal, but from my own habit of comfortable avoidance, has been the actual work of the last 2 years. What Doug's silence taught me is that some people will let 20 years of friendship dissolve without a single word rather than stand in front of what they did. That used to make me furious. Now it just makes me a little sad. A person who can do that was never quite who I thought they were. The loss was real. The friendship, at least the version I believed in, maybe wasn't. What Lena's choices taught me is that character isn't what someone shows you in the good years. It's what they do with their options when they think the cost of honesty is too high. She decided again and again that maintaining her version of things was worth whatever it required. That is a choice about who you are. Nobody made it for her. And what this whole chapter has taught me, the part I'll carry forward, is that the life worth building is the one you can actually see clearly, not the comfortable one, not the one that requires you to file things away and not look too hard at the second phone. The real one, even when it's harder to stand in. Buckley still steals the sunny spot on the back porch every morning. I still make coffee that's too hot and drink it anyway. The string lights in Ohio were probably still on that fence. The world kept being itself through all of it, which I find oddly reassuring. I drove on. That's the part I'm most proud of.